Deep in the forest of northern Florida, there was once a small town that most Americans have never heard of. It wasn't marked on many maps. It rarely appeared in newspapers. Yet for the families who lived there, it was a place of opportunity, independence, and hope. Black farmers owned land. Black workers built businesses. And a quiet community grew stronger year after year. For a brief moment in history, this hidden settlement became a place where black families could live with dignity and build a future for their children. But in January of 1923, something happened that would change everything. A rumor began spreading across the nearby towns. Anger quickly followed, and within days, the peaceful community of Rosewood would be attacked, burned, and nearly erased from existence. Homes would be destroyed. Families would flee into the forests, and a thriving black town would vanish almost overnight. For decades afterward, the story would be buried in silence, but the truth about what happened in Rosewood never completely disappeared. This is the story of the secret black city that once thrived in America and how it was destroyed. At the start of the 20th century, much of the American South was still shaped by the long shadow of segregation. Opportunities for black families were limited, and discrimination affected nearly every part of daily life. Many communities across the region were divided by race, with black citizens often pushed to the margins of economic and political power. Yet despite these barriers, small pockets of independence began to emerge in certain places, where black families found ways to build their own communities. One of those places was a quiet settlement tucked deep within the pine forests of Levy County in northern Florida. That settlement was Rosewood. Rosewood was never a large town, but what it lacked in size it made up for in determination and resilience. The town had first been established in the late 1800s during a period when the region's economy depended heavily on the timber industry. The surrounding forests were filled with towering cedar trees, which were harvested and processed in nearby mills. In fact, the town itself was named after the reddish cedar, that once grew abundantly in the area. At first, both black and white workers lived in the community, helping operate the sawmills and transport lumber to other parts of Florida. But as the years passed, the town gradually became a predominantly black community as many white residents moved to neighboring towns where other economic opportunities were developing. By the early 1900s, Rosewood had developed into a small but vibrant settlement. Wooden homes lined the sandy roads that wound through the town. Churches stood at the center of the community, serving not only as places of worship, but also as gathering points where families came together to celebrate, share news, and support one another. There was a school where children learned to read and write, preparing them for futures their parents hoped would be brighter than their own pasts. Many of the residents worked as farmers, laborers, or craftsmen. Some traveled to nearby towns for work, while others operated small businesses within the community itself. Despite the challenges of the era, families in Rosewood were slowly building stability. Land ownership gave them a sense of independence that was rare for black communities in the South at the time. Parents believed that through hard work and cooperation, their children might one day inherit a better life. Life in Rosewood moved at a peaceful rhythm. Days were filled with the sound of work, axes striking wood, wagons rolling down dirt roads, and the voices of neighbors greeting each other as they passed by. Evenings often brought the softer sounds of music and conversation drifting from front porches as families gathered after long days of labor. On Sundays, the churches filled with voices raised in song and prayer, reinforcing the bonds that held the community together. But Rosewood did not exist in isolation from the world around it. Just a few miles away was the town of Sumner, a predominantly white community whose economy was also tied to the timber industry. Residents of the two towns interacted frequently, especially through work and trade. Many black laborers from Rosewood found employment in Sumner's mills and businesses. For years, the relationship between the towns remained relatively stable, though it was always shaped by the racial hierarchy that defined the South during that period. Still, within the boundaries of Rosewood, families continued building lives rooted in resilience and hope. Parents watched their children grow up surrounded by neighbors who looked out for one another. Community gatherings strengthened friendships that stretched across generations. It was not a place of great wealth or fame, but it was a place where people believed they could create a future. Yet history often turns on moments that no one can predict. And in the first days of January 1923, a single accusation made in the nearby town of Sumner would unleash a wave of violence that would reach into the heart of Rosewood. Within days, the peaceful rhythm of life in this hidden black community would be shattered, and the town that had quietly thrived for decades would soon face destruction. Long before violence reached its quiet streets, life in Rosewood moved with a steady and comforting rhythm. The town may have been small and hidden among the forests of northern Florida, but for the families who lived there, it represented something powerful, a chance to build a life with dignity, stability, and independence. In a time when opportunities for Black Americans were severely limited across much of the South, communities like Rosewood offered a rare sense of ownership and belonging. The residents knew the world outside their town was filled with discrimination and danger, but within their community, they had created a place where families support each other and where children could grow up surrounded by hope. The heart of Rosewood was its people. Most of the residents were hard-working families who had lived in the region for years. Some were farmers who cultivated small plots of land, growing crops that helped feed their families and sometimes brought in modest income. Others worked as laborers in nearby towns, traveling to lumber mills and industrial sites where they earned wages that were then brought back to support their households. Every dollar mattered, and every bit of progress felt like a victory against the limitations placed on them by the society of that era. Despite these challenges, the community continued to grow stronger. Wooden homes lined the sandy roads that ran through the town, many of them built by the residents themselves. These houses were simple but full of life. Children played in the yards while parents worked in gardens or repaired tools in wagons. Front porches became gathering places in the evenings, where neighbors sat together and talked as the warm Florida air settled over town. Laughter, music, and storytelling filled these quiet moments, creating memories that families would carry for the rest of their lives. Churches stood at the center of the town's social life. On Sundays, residents of Rosewood dressed in their finest clothes and gathered for worship. The church was more than a religious institution. It was the foundation of the community. It was where people shared news, resolved disputes, celebrated milestones, and offered support during difficult times. The voices of the congregation often filled the building with powerful songs that echoed beyond its wooden walls, carrying across the nearby fields and forests. Education was also deeply valued in Rosewood. The town had a small school where children learned reading, writing, and arithmetic. Teachers worked hard to give their students knowledge that could help them navigate a challenging world. Parents believed education was one of the few tools their children could use to build better futures. Even though resources were limited, the determination to learn remained strong. For many families, watching their children walk to school each morning was a symbol of progress and possibility. Economic life in Rosewood was modest but steady. Some residents operated small businesses that served the needs of the community. There were general stores where families could purchase supplies, as well as craftsmen who repaired tools, wagons, and farm equipment. These businesses kept money circulating within the town and helped strengthen the local economy. The resident understood that supporting each other's work was essential for survival in a society that often denied them equal opportunities. Just a few miles away stood the neighboring town of Sumner, which was predominantly white and closely connected to the timber industry that dominated the region. Many Black residents from Rosewood traveled to Sumner for employment in its lumber mills and related businesses. The relationship between the two towns was complicated. While economic interactions were common, the broader social structure of the time meant that racial tensions were never far beneath the surface. The South during the early 20th century was governed by strict segregation laws and deeply entrenched racial divisions. Yet within the boundaries of Rosewood itself, residents focused on building a peaceful and supportive environment. Community events brought people together regularly. Weddings, church gatherings, and seasonal celebrations were moments when families set aside their worries and enjoyed each other's company. Music played an important role in these events, with hymns and folk songs often filling the air. These gatherings strengthened the bonds between neighbors and reinforced the sense that Rosewood was more than just a town. It was a family. The surrounding landscape added to the quiet beauty of life in the community. Dense forests of pine and cedar stretched across the region, and narrow dirt roads connected the town to nearby settlements. The natural environment provided both resources and shelter. Residents hunted, fished, and gathered wood from the forest, relying on the land to support their daily lives. At the same time, the trees created a sense of isolation that made Rosewood feel protected from the outside world. But even in this peaceful setting, the residents were aware of the dangers that existed beyond their community. News of racial violence in other parts of the South occasionally reached the town, reminding families that safety was never guaranteed. Stories of injustice and discrimination circulated quietly, often discussed in hushed tones among adults who wanted to shield their children from fear. These conversations served as warnings that the stability they had built could be fragile. Despite these concerns, most residents believed their community would endure. They had invested years of hard work into building homes, raising families, and creating a place where they could live with dignity. The town had survived economic changes and social challenges before, and there was little reason to believe that the future would be any different. Yet, history has a way of changing direction without warning. In the final days of December 1922, life in Rosewood appeared as peaceful as ever. Families prepared for the new year. Children continued attending school, and workers traveled their usual routes between Rosewood and the neighboring town of Sumner. Nothing about those days suggested that the community was standing on the edge of a disaster. But on the morning of January 1st, 1923, an event occurred in Sumner that would ignite a chain of rumors, accusations, and anger. Within hours, those rumors would begin spreading through the surrounding towns. And soon, the quiet community of Rosewood would find itself at the center of a storm it could never have predicted. The first day of January 1923 began like any other quiet winter morning in the small Florida town of Sumner. The holiday season had just passed, and many families were slowly returning to their routines after celebrating the new year. The lumber mills that supported the local economy would soon resume their steady operations, and workers were preparing to return to long days of labor among the towering cedar forests surrounding the area. Nothing about the morning suggested that within hours, a rumor would ignite a chain of events that would soon threaten the nearby black community of Rosewood. In one modest home in Sumner lived a young white woman named Fannie Taylor. On that morning, neighbors suddenly heard screams coming from her house. The cries were loud and frantic, immediately drawing attention from people nearby. Within minutes, concerned residents rushed toward the home to see what had happened. When they entered the house, they found Taylor visibly shaken and distressed. According to the account she gave at the time, she claimed that an unknown black man had entered her home and attacked her. The story spread rapidly among the residents of Sumner, many of whom were already influenced by the racial tensions that shaped life in the American South during that era. Accusations involving interracial violence were often treated with extreme seriousness, and rumors could move through communities with astonishing speed. Within a short time, word of the alleged attack had spread across Sumner and into surrounding areas. Anger and suspicion began building among the town's white residents. Groups of men gathered to discuss what had happened, and many quickly became convinced that the attacker must have come from a nearby black community of Rosewood. Local authorities soon became involved. The county sheriff, Robert Elias Walker, began organizing a search for the person responsible. At first, the investigation focused on tracking a man named Jesse Hunter, a black laborer who had reportedly escaped from a prison work gang sometime earlier. Many residents of Sumner quickly assumed that Hunter must have been the attacker described by Taylor, even though there was little evidence connecting him to the incident. As the day progressed, groups of armed men began forming search parties. Some claimed they were helping the sheriff track down the suspect, while others appeared driven by anger and a desire for revenge. These men spread out across the surrounding countryside, moving through forests and rural roads as they searched for any sign of the man they believed responsible. The search soon expanded beyond Sumner. Rumors began circulating that the suspect might be hiding in Rosewood, the small black settlement located just a few miles away. For many of the men participating in the search, this assumption was enough to justify turning their attention toward the town. Meanwhile, life in Rosewood continued largely unaware of the storm that was forming nearby. Residents were going about their daily routines, tending to farms, visiting neighbors, and preparing meals for their families. The community had no reason to believe that it was about to become the focus of growing suspicion and hostility. But the rumors continued spreading. Each retelling of the story seemed to grow more dramatic and more alarming. As the details changed and emotions intensified, anger among the white residents of Sumner began transforming into something far more dangerous. By late afternoon, the search parties had grown larger. Some men arrived from neighboring towns after hearing about the alleged attack. Many carried rifles or shotguns, and their conversations were increasingly filled with anger and determination. The line between an official investigation and a vigilante mob was beginning to blur. Sheriff Robert Elias Walker attempted to maintain order as the situation escalated. He understood that tensions were rising rapidly and that violence could easily erupt if the crowd lost control. However, the number of armed men gathering in the area made the situation difficult to manage. The emotional atmosphere had already reached a point where reason and caution were struggling to keep pace with anger and fear. As night approached, the search continued moving closer to Rosewood. Some members of the growing mob insisted that the suspect must be hiding in the town. Others simply believed that someone in the community must know where he was. For them, entering Rosewood and questioning its residents seemed like the next logical step. Inside the quiet homes of Rosewood, families were finishing dinner and settling into their evening routines. Children were being prepared for bed. Neighbors exchanged greetings as the day came to an end. The peaceful rhythm that had defined life in the community for years remained intact, at least for the moment. But beyond the dark tree line surrounding the town, a group of armed men was already moving in their direction. What had begun as an accusation in a nearby house had now evolved into something far more dangerous. Fueled by rumors and racial tension, the search parties were turning into a mob. And as that mob approached Rosewood, the residents of the quiet community were about to find themselves caught in a situation they could not control. Within hours, the first violent confrontation would occur, and the peaceful town that had stood quietly among the forest for decades would suddenly become the center of one of the most devastating episodes in American history, the Rosewood Massacre. As darkness settled over the forests of Levy County on the night of January 1st, 1923, tension hung heavily in the air around the quiet community of Rosewood. The search for the man accused of attacking Fannie Taylor had grown increasingly aggressive throughout the day. What had begun as an investigation led by local authorities was now transforming into something far more dangerous. Armed men from a nearby town of Sumner and surrounding areas had gathered in growing numbers, many of them convinced that someone in Rosewood was hiding the suspected fugitive Jesse Hunter. The mob moved to the dark countryside, carrying rifles, shotguns, and lanterns that flickered in the cold night air. Their voices carried through the trees as they shouted accusations and demanded answers. The search parties had grown larger as more men joined them, fueled by rumors and rising anger. For many of them, the mission was no longer simply about finding a suspect. The mood had shifted towards something far more threatening, a collective determination to confront the black residents of Rosewood and force them to reveal what they believed was being hidden. Inside the town, most families were unaware of just how serious the situation had become. Evening routines continued much as they always had. Parents finished preparing meals, children prepared for bed, and neighbors exchanged quiet conversations as the day came to an end. The peaceful life that residents had built in Rosewood had endured for decades, and few could imagine that violence was now approaching their community. But before long, the first signs of danger began to appear. The sound of approaching wagons and horses echoed along the narrow dirt roads leading toward the town. Flickering lantern lights began appearing through the darkness of the surrounding woods. Groups of armed men slowly entered the outskirts of Rosewood, moving cautiously but with clear purpose. They were searching for someone they believed to be hiding among the town's residents. The arrival of these armed groups immediately caused fear and confusion. Some residents stepped outside their homes to see what was happening, only to find themselves confronted by angry men demanding information. Questions were shouted across yards and roads. The men insisted that the suspect they were searching for must be hiding somewhere within the community. Many of the residents of Rosewood tried to explain that they knew nothing about the accusations being made. Families who had spent the entire day working, caring for children, or attending to their homes were suddenly forced into a tense and frightening confrontation. They could see the anger in the faces of the men who had arrived, and it quickly became clear that reason alone might not be enough to calm the situation. Local authorities, including Robert Elias Walker, attempted to maintain some control over the growing mob. The sheriff understood that if the situation spiraled further out of control, the consequences could be catastrophic. He tried to organize a search and prevent unnecessary violence, but the sheer number of armed men and the intensity of their anger made the task nearly impossible. As the night progressed, the mob began conducting searches of homes in and around Rosewood. Armed men moved from property to property, demanding to know if anyone had seen Jesse Hunter. Doors were knocked on aggressively, and families were forced to answer questions under the threatening presence of rifles and shotguns. The fear spreading through the community was unmistakable. Residents who had once felt safe within the boundaries of their town now realized that their security was rapidly disappearing. Parents began gathering their children closer, unsure of what might happen next. Some families considered leaving the town temporarily, hoping to escape the growing hostility surrounding them. Then, the situation took a darker turn. Late that night, members of the mob arrived at the home of a black resident named Sam Carter. Carter was known in the area as a hard-working man who had often assisted neighbors with transportation using his wagon. The mob believed that he might have knowledge about the fugitive they were searching for. Under intense pressure and threats of violence, Carter was forced to speak with the mob. Reports from the time suggest that he may have been compelled to claim that he had helped transport the suspect at some point earlier. Whether this statement was made under fear or misinterpreted by the crowd remains unclear, but the mob quickly treated it as confirmation of their suspicions. Instead of calming the situation, this development only inflamed the mob further. Believing they had finally uncovered evidence linking Rosewood residents to the fugitive, the crowd's anger exploded. Carter was taken away by the mob, and despite the presence of law enforcement in the area, he was brutally killed. The act sent a terrifying message to the entire community. News of the killing spread rapidly through Rosewood. Families who had hoped the situation might pass peacefully now understood that their town was in grave danger. Panic began spreading among residents as they realized that the mob was no longer simply searching for a suspect. It had become violent and uncontrollable. Throughout the night, armed groups continued moving to the area surrounding Rosewood. Some residents began preparing to flee into the forest if the situation worsened. The dense woods that surrounded the town suddenly seemed like the only possible refuge if the mob decided to attack. But the worst had not yet arrived. Over the next several days, the mob would grow even larger as more men from surrounding counties traveled to the area after hearing rumors about the events unfolding there. Armed groups would return again and again, increasingly determined to punish the residents of Rosewood for a crime that had never been proven. Within a matter of days, homes would burn, families would run for their lives, and the peaceful community that had stood for decades would face destruction. The attack that began as a search would soon transform into one of the most devastating acts of racial violence in American history, the Rosewood Massacre. And for the residents of Rosewood, survival would soon depend on escaping the town they once called home. By the time the sun rose over the forest surrounding Rosewood in the first days of January 1923, the quiet community had already been shaken by fear and violence. The killing of Sam Carter had sent a chilling message through the town. Residents now understood that the mob searching for Jesse Hunter was not simply looking for answers. The situation had become unpredictable, fueled by anger, rumors, and racial tension that had been building across the region for years. Despite the growing danger, many families in Rosewood hoped the violence might fade as quickly as it had begun. They believed that once authorities realized the accusations were unsupported, the mob might disperse and allow the town to return to its peaceful rhythm. But instead of calming, the situation escalated dramatically. News of the events surrounding Rosewood spread rapidly throughout nearby counties. Stories traveled from town to town, often exaggerated and distorted with each retelling. As rumors grew more sensational, they attracted the attention of people who had no connection to the original incident in Sumner. Yet many of them arrived with weapons and a willingness to join the growing mob. Within days, hundreds of armed men began gathering around the area. Some traveled from neighboring towns, while others came from distant communities after hearing reports of the supposed attack. Many believed they were participating in a search for justice. Others were simply drawn by anger or curiosity. Regardless of their reasons, the result was the same. The number of armed men surrounding Rosewood continued to grow. Inside the town, fear had begun spreading among the residents. Families quietly discussed the possibility of leaving their homes, at least temporarily, until the situation calmed. Some packed essential belongings, while others stayed close to their houses, hoping that the presence of law enforcement might still prevent further violence. But the mob had already begun to lose all restraint. On the evening of January 4th, tension reached a breaking point. Armed groups moved towards several homes in Rosewood, convinced that the suspect they were searching for was being hidden there. One of the homes they approached belonged to the Carrier family, a well-known household in the community. Members of the mob surrounded the house, demanding that the residents reveal the location of Jesse Hunter. Inside the home, the family feared for their lives. They had no knowledge of the fugitive the mob was seeking, yet the crowd outside seemed determined to force confession or extract information by any means necessary. The situation quickly became volatile. As the confrontation intensified, gunfire suddenly erupted. Shots rang out in the darkness, echoing through the surrounding trees. Chaos broke loose as members of the mob exchanged gunfire with the people inside the house. The violent clash left several individuals injured and further inflamed the anger of the crowd. From that moment forward, the mob's actions shifted from intimidation to outright destruction. Convinced that the residents of Rosewood were resisting them, many members of the mob began setting fire to buildings throughout the town. Homes that had once been filled with laughter, family gatherings, and quiet daily life were suddenly engulfed in flames. Fire spread rapidly from house to house, fueled by dry wood and strong winds that carried sparks across the settlement. Panic swept through the community. Families rushed into the streets as smoke filled the air and the glow of burning buildings illuminated the night sky. Parents grabbed their children and fled their homes with little more than the clothes they were wearing. Many had no time to gather possessions or valuables. Survival became the only priority. The forest surrounding Rosewood became the refuge for dozens of terrified residents. Men, women, and children ran into the dense woods, hiding among trees and thick underbrush as the mob continued burning the town behind them. Some families walked for miles through the darkness, hoping to reach safety in neighboring communities. For those hiding in the forest, the experience was terrifying. Winter nights in northern Florida could be cold, and many people had fled without coats or blankets. Parents struggled to keep their children quiet as armed men continued moving through the area searching for anyone who might still be hiding nearby. Meanwhile, the destruction of Rosewood continued. Buildings that had once represented years of hard work and perseverance were reduced to ashes. Churches, homes, and businesses burned as the mob moved methodically through the town. The community that had stood quietly among the forest for decades was being erased piece by piece. Some residents managed to escape by boarding trains that passed through the region. Railway workers and sympathetic individuals helped smuggle survivors out of the area, allowing them to flee before the violence could reach them. These escapes saved lives, but they also marked the beginning of a long exile for many families who would never return to the town they once called home. By the time the violence finally subsided, Rosewood had been almost completely destroyed. The thriving community that had existed for generations was now little more than a field of ashes and ruins. Families were scattered across the state, many forced to rebuild their lives in unfamiliar places far from the homes they had lost. In the aftermath, the events would become known as the Rosewood Massacre, one of the most devastating acts of racial violence in American history. But for many survivors, the tragedy did not end with the destruction of the town. In the years that followed, a strange and powerful silence would fall over the story of Rosewood. For decades, few people would speak about what had happened there, and the once thriving community would slowly disappear not only from the landscape, but from the pages of history itself. When the fires finally died down in January of 1923, almost nothing remained of Rosewood. The homes, churches, and businesses that had once stood proudly in the small forest community were reduced to blackened ruins. What had once been a thriving settlement filled with families, laughter, and hope had been wiped from the landscape in only a matter of days. For the survivors who escaped into surrounding forests, the tragedy was far from over. The violence had destroyed not only their homes, but also the sense of safety and belonging they had worked so hard to build. Many of the residents who fled that night spent hours hiding in the cold woods, waiting for the danger to pass. Parents held their children close, trying to comfort them while listening for sounds of approaching mobs. Some families walked miles through thick forests, desperate to reach neighboring towns where they might find safety. Others were eventually rescued by sympathetic individuals who helped them board trains passing through the region, allowing them to escape before the violence could reach them again. But leaving Rosewood meant leaving behind nearly everything they owned. Houses, farms, furniture, family photographs, and personal belongings had either been destroyed in the fires or abandoned during the frantic escape. Many survivors arrived in other towns with little more than the clothes they were wearing. They were forced to start their lives again from nothing. Some families settled in cities across Florida. Others moved to different states entirely, hoping to find places where they could rebuild their lives away from the trauma of what happened. But even as they moved forward, the memory of Rosewood remained with them. For many survivors, the loss of their town felt like losing a piece of their identity. In the years following the tragedy, the events that had taken place during the Rosewood Massacre were rarely discussed publicly. Newspapers reported on the violence at the time, but as the years passed, the story slowly faded from a national conversation. No one was ever successfully prosecuted for the destruction of the town. Investigations were limited, and the justice that survivors hoped for never arrived. As time went on, a heavy silence settled over the story of Rosewood. Many of the survivors chose not to speak about their experiences, even to their own children. The trauma of the attack remained deeply personal, and some believed that talking about it might expose them to further danger. Others simply found the memories too painful to revisit. This silence lasted for decades. Entire generations grew up unaware that a thriving black community had once existed in the forests of Levy County. The physical traces of Rosewood slowly disappeared as nature reclaimed the land. Trees grew over the roads where children had once played. The foundations of burned homes became hidden beneath layers of soil and vegetation. To an outsider passing through the region, there was little indication that a town had ever existed there at all. But the story was not completely lost. Within the families of the survivors, memories were quietly preserved. Elders occasionally shared fragments of the story with younger relatives, ensuring that the truth would not disappear entirely. These private conversations kept the history alive, even while the broader world remained unaware of what had happened. Decades later, historians and journalists began investigating the events surrounding the destruction of Rosewood. Survivors who had remained silent for most of their lives slowly began sharing their experiences. Their testimonies revealed the full scale of the tragedy and helped piece together a clearer picture of what had occurred in 1923. As these stories emerged, public awareness of the Rosewood Massacre began to grow. Scholars, activists, and community leaders worked to ensure that the history of the town would finally be acknowledged. The once-forgotten community of Rosewood began to reappear in historical records, documentaries, and academic research. In 1994, more than 70 years after the destruction of the town, the state of Florida took a historic step. After reviewing the evidence and listening to the testimonies of survivors and their descendants, lawmakers approved compensation for those affected by the massacre. It was one of the first times in American history that a state government formally acknowledged and compensated victims of racial violence. While no amount of compensation could replace the homes, lives, and community that had been lost, the decision represented an important moment of recognition. It acknowledged that what had happened in Rosewood was not simply a forgotten incident. It was a tragedy that deserved to be remembered. Today, the land where Rosewood once stood remains quiet. A historical marker now tells visitors about the town that existed there and the events that led to its destruction. For many people who travel through the area, it serves as a reminder that history can sometimes be hidden in the most unexpected places. The story of Rosewood is not only a story of violence and loss, it is also a story of resilience. The survivors who escaped the destruction carried their memories forward, ensuring that the truth would eventually be heard. Their courage in sharing their experiences decades later allowed the world to finally understand what had been lost. And today, the memory of Rosewood stands as a reminder of the strength of the community that once thrived there and of the importance of preserving history, so that such tragedies are never forgotten again.